Good morning to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today. Welcome to today's learning session, co-presented by the KC Chamber and the Urban Neighborhood Initiative. Today, we're going to examine the racial inequities in housing. Marshall Field, entrepreneur and founder of the Chicago-based Marshall Field department store, may have put it best when he said about real estate: buying real estate is not only the best way, the quickest way, the safest way, but it's the only way to become wealthy. But here in Kansas City and in cities across the country, too many members of the community could not do that. Through redlining policies, neighborhood covenants, and specific real estate practices, Black families and other families of color were kept from being able to own homes in certain areas, and in many cases, they weren't able to own a home at all. That meant they missed out on not only having a place of their own, but years of building generational wealth and stability. I want to thank everyone for being here today again. The Urban Neighborhood Initiative has partnered with the Chamber on several listening and learning sessions this year. Before we continue, I want to give a thanks to the Chamber's presenting diversity sponsors for 2020: Community America Credit Union, Evergy, Hallmark, and T-Mobile. Your continued support allowed us to keep doing this work to better our community. So far in these sessions, we've focused on the history of systemic racism in Kansas City and looked at the future with a special group of young Black men and women. Today, we're going to look at historic and current factors underpinning an important area of systemic racism in America and Kansas City. That area is housing. As was said earlier, our goal at UNI is to break the generational cycle of poverty and to build healthy neighborhoods. We are doing that through our programs and initiatives at UNI. Living in a poor neighborhood changes everything about your life. Research and experience show that families do better when they live in strong and supportive communities. In short, not only your zip code matters, not only your neighborhood matters, your block matters as well. Where you live matters. That's why UNI partners with urban core neighborhoods to build a healthy and equitable physical environment, as well as a healthy social environment where neighbors connect with one another. A healthy physical environment starts with quality, affordable housing. And if we want to move forward successfully, we have to look back and understand how we got here. Today, we're going to examine the policies and practices that built walls decades ago that many families in Kansas City and elsewhere are still trying to climb. We hope that what you hear today will lead you to take action to help in tearing down those walls. You'll be able to submit your questions in the chat function, and please do that while our presenters are speaking, and we will address questions during our question and answer segment. Our first guest has a long history working for affordable housing. She is currently Vice President of Purpose-Built Communities, an Atlanta-based organization and national network of which UNI is a member. Their mission is to break the intergenerational cycle of poverty through holistic community development, and they advise and support communities in doing that. Mickey, we welcome you.
Good morning, and thank you, Diane, for that introduction. And it is a pleasure to be a part of this panel this morning. I want to start out by saying that in order for us to have a really honest an authentic conversation about racial inequities and housing, we have to begin by acknowledging the history of our nation, and acknowledging and being honest about the foundation of our nation rests on the principles of white superiority. Thank you. So we all know Africans arrived in North America, not as willing immigrants, but a few as indentured servants, but the vast majority as slaves, okay? And as such, Africans, who were not considered citizens of the burgeoning nation, were by and large not granted the rights and privileges afforded their white owners. And that established the hierarchy of racism in America. That's where we're starting. Now, however, there were those who took issue with the institution of slavery. And as the nation grew, measures were enacted to limit the expansion of slavery beyond the South, including the enactment of the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, which limited the expansion of slavery north of the Ohio River, and also the act prohibiting the importation of slaves in 1807. That provided that no new slaves would be imported to the United States. However, that latter measure, don't be mistaken, did nothing to curtail the domestic slave trade. As a matter of fact, with the advent of the cotton gin, it actually exacerbated and made the domestic slave trade that much more profitable, because cotton was so integral to the economy of the South. And it would be more than half a century before the Civil War would ever decide the issue of slavery. Now, to be clear, most Northerners didn't disagree that African slaves were inferior to whites. It's just that the Northern economy was not inextricably tied to slave labor, okay? So I think they probably felt more inclined to allow the morality to prevail. And that's really, really important to understand, because segregation, as you'll see throughout my presentation and also Tyler's presentation, was in no way confined to the South. And segregation also was not a partisan issue. In the 12 years following the Civil War, the period we all know as Reconstruction, federal laws were passed granting basic rights to former slaves. While the primary function of Reconstruction really was about the readmittance of the Southern states that seceded from the Union, it was during this period, though, that an attempt was made to rectify and remedy the inequities of slavery. So these measures included the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which granted citizenship to former slaves, as well as the ratification of the 14th Amendment, sort of further delineating citizenship, and also the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which is really important because that's the amendment that granted the right to vote to slaves. And during that time, Reconstruction saw the election of 16 African-Americans serving in Congress, and you will see some of them on the screen here, which included Senators Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce. More than 600 state legislatures and hundreds more local offices across the South. However, of course, the Southern Democrats, who again were not happy about the abolition of slavery and the effect that it had on Southern states, weren't pleased and took drastic measures, including violence at times, to undermine African-American rights, particularly as it related to voting. And unfortunately, as Reconstruction went on, Northern Republican support for Reconstruction measures diminished, especially as it related to those issues tied to the rights of slaves. And very little was done to dissuade Southern Democrats from the tactics that they used in order to try to prevent African Americans from voting. Now, by 1877, Democrats had already regained political power in the Southern states and began to pass those laws that we know as Jim Crow laws. Laws officially segregating African Americans from whites. And these laws effectively ended Reconstruction and would be enforced for almost the next 100 years. Nonetheless, the years immediately following the Civil War, many African Americans had been appointed to high-ranking federal positions. Federal agencies, by and large, were integrated, allowing African Americans and whites to work alongside one another. All of that changed, however, with the election of Woodrow Wilson as president in 1913. Wilson was a Democrat. And he was an ardent racist. He went about segregating the federal workforce, which really was the only place at that time where one might find some semblance of equity. I'm going to quote an article by journalist Dylan Matthews, who said, easily the worst part of Wilson's record as president was overseeing the resegregation of multiple agencies in the federal government, which had surprisingly integrated as a result of Reconstruction. At an April 11th, 1913 cabinet meeting, the Postmaster General, Albert Burleson, argued for segregating the railway mail system. Wilson took absolutely no exception to the fact that Burleson wanted to institute segregation, saying that he wished the matter adjusted in a way to make the least friction. So soon discriminatory policies expanded, and according to the History of African American Experiences at the Postal Service published by the National Postal Museum, segregation was quickly implemented at the post office department headquarters in DC. And many African American employees were either downgraded or even fired. Employees who were downgraded were transferred to the dead letter office, where they did not interact with the public. And the few African Americans who remained at the main post offices were put to work behind screens and out of customers' sites. Both the post office and the Treasury Department, federal agencies, also created separate bathrooms, lunchrooms for African Americans and white employees. And it was further reported in 1914 that Wilson instituted a policy whereby federal job seekers needed to attach photographs to their applications. And despite protests from civil rights leaders at this time, Wilson refused to budge. It is reported that he would say, I do not approve. Would say that I do not approve the segregation that is being attempted in several, the integration that is being attempted in several departments. He wrote a point declaring that it was in African Americans' interest to be separate from their white co-workers. Now, the effect of Wilson's segregation measures resulted in African Americans working primarily in unskilled jobs. And that would not change in the administrations that succeeded him as well. Further compounding the plight of African Americans was the stock market crash of 1929, which resulted in those entry-level, low-paying jobs either being filled by whites or disappearing completely. So the Great Depression, the 10-year period following the stock market crash, was the worst economic downturn the world had ever experienced. Everyone felt the devastating effects of the Great Depression, but African Americans were hit especially hard, experiencing the highest unemployment rate during the 1930s. And since they were already consigned the lowest paying occupations, African Americans had no financial safety net to rely upon when the economy collapsed. According to the Library of Congress, fully 1/2, 50% of African Americans were unemployed in 1932. In her book, To Ask for Equal Chance, African Americans in the Great Depression, historian Sherilyn Grinberg notes that unemployment rate in the South were double and sometimes even triple that of the white population. In Atlanta, nearly 70% of Black workers were jobless in 1934. In cities across the North, approximately 25% of white workers were unemployed in 1932, where jobless rates among African Americans topped 50%. In Chicago, Pittsburgh, and 60% in Philadelphia and Detroit. So with absolutely nothing to lose, hundreds of thousands of African American sharecroppers consumed by debt took part in what was known as the Great Migration from the rural South to the North in search of better job and housing opportunities. Again, according to Greenberg, by 1940, 1.75 million African Americans had moved from the South to cities in the North and in the West. Now, from the time that African Americans had been granted the right to vote up until the Great Depression, they had traditionally voted with the Republican Party, which they associated with the abolition of slavery and the advent of Reconstruction. But in reality, their lives hadn't really improved very much. And in the presidential election of 1932, African Americans were drawn to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal. Programs aimed at providing much sought after relief and recovery from the Great Depression. Wanting access to benefits outlined under the New Deal, African Americans switched their political allegiances to become a key part of the Democratic Party. Now, Roosevelt, he recognized that loyalty from African American voters, and he did appoint them, some of them, to high-ranking roles in his administration. He also had a group of trusted African American advisors that were known as the Black Cabinet, and you can see them here on the slide. And which I like to point out, front and center, it even included a woman, Mary McLeod Bethune. But, as is often the case, there were limits in how far even the most progressive leaders would go when it came to addressing issues important to African Americans. Since Roosevelt did need the support of Southern Democrats to pass his New Deal agenda, he did not advocate for the passage of the federal anti-lynching laws or support the ban on the poll tax that prevented many African Americans from even voting in the first place. But nonetheless, the economic support that was somewhat received by African Americans under the New Deal solidified their new allegiance and their loyalty to the Democratic Party. And despite their overwhelming loyalty to President Franklin, the program under New Deal still discriminated against African Americans. And largely, while the programs provided African Americans with much needed economic and financial support, unfortunately, it was left to states to administer the programs, and racial segregation was still systemically enforced. The New Deal did little to change existing racial discrimination in Jim Crow laws during the 1930s. In addition to joblessness, arguably, one of the most pressing issues that needed to be addressed by President Franklin in the New Deal program was the lack of affordable quality housing. At the end of World War II, there ushered in a wave of returning veterans. The Public Works Administration was the first federal agency to address the housing shortage and also address construction jobs for unemployment. But by this time, neighborhoods in large cities were primarily segregated by race, and the most coveted public housing programs that came out of the Public Works Administration were constructed for white middle class families in white neighborhoods. Now I want to stop here for a minute and just to let you know, if you really want to do a deep dive into the policies that not only contributed to segregation, but also sanctioned it, you should please get a copy of The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And this is an amazing book, and it outlines the countless federal, state, and local laws enacted to perpetuate segregation of all races and disadvantage African Americans. And a lot of the information that I'll talk about, you can find in the book, and I'm summarizing here. Now, public housing agencies established preferences, like I said, for war veterans. And it was at this time that they began to institute these really stringent tenant selection criteria, which included, only 2-parent households, and you had to produce a marriage license in order to prove so. You would get home visits to determine whether you had good furniture or housekeeping habits, and whether or not your children were well behaved, whether you had a stable job, good credit, and no problems. Those were all a part of qualifying for public housing at that time. And typically tenants had great civil service jobs and were small business owners. Now there were public housing projects that were built in less desirable neighborhoods occupied by low-income African Americans, where unlike projects for middle-class whites who paid market rate rents that was fully covered construction and operating costs, projects for low-income Blacks were heavily subsidized with federal and sometimes state and local funds. However, not all public housing projects constructed for African Americans were intended for low-income African Americans. There existed those projects that were aimed at stable, higher income African Americans where rents were not subsidized. There did not exist, however, the option under the New Deal public housing programs for the races to mix, regardless of income. There was a rule adopted under the New Deal that established that public housing projects could not alter the racial composition of a neighborhood. And like I said, by this time, neighborhoods were by and large divided on race. But as projects filled up with middle-class whites, other federal policies lured these families out of the projects to even whiter suburbs. There's the mortgage insurance programs from the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, and the Veterans Administration, from which African American families, again, regardless of income, were primarily excluded. FHA and VHA mortgages guaranteed were so favorable that it cost less to own a single family home than it did to rent in public housing projects. And in the 1950s, as the pace of construction of single family homes increased, the housing shortage lessened, and white families took advantage of these guarantees and moved from urban public housing projects to the suburbs. Now, whether, in the city or the suburbs, the FHA required developers who were seeking its finances to include restrictive covenants in their homeowner deeds prohibiting sales or resales to African Americans. Again, that was an FHA, a federal requirement that restrictive covenants be included. In addition to those restrictive covenants, the federal government enforced segregation through redlining. Okay, and what I have on the screen here is a redlining map for the city of Atlanta and also for the south side of Chicago. And the term redlining comes from these development maps under the direction of FHA of every metropolitan area in the country. And the maps were first color coded by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which really was set up in order to prevent foreclosure and so that homeowners could remain in their home and do refinancing. But then by the Federal Housing Administration and subsequently adopted by the VA, the Veterans Administration. And the color codes were designed to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. So green, for example, indicated the best of the best neighborhoods. Blue indicated that the area was still desirable. Yellow was where neighborhoods were deemed questionable. And anywhere African Americans lived, or anywhere African Americans lived nearby, were color coded red to indicate that these neighborhoods were too risky, way too risky to insure mortgages. Now, the official position of the Federal Housing Administration, which according to Rothstein in his book, underwrote $120 billion in new housing construction between 1934 and 1962. And that African Americans were adversely impacted property values. Again, that was the stance of the Federal Housing Administration. So solidifying racial exclusion into programs designed to promote homeownership, the underwriting manual, so the regulations, the guidelines of the Federal Housing Administration suggested that the best financial bets were those where safeguards, such as highways and other barriers that separated communities, could prevent, and I'm quoting, the infiltration of lower class occupancy and inharmonious racial groups. The manual further stated that incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans simply could not be insured. Home buyers seeking to purchase in red zone neighborhoods, those with high percentages of Black residents, regardless of the wealth of those residents, would likely be denied a mortgage, and the loans would receive no federal support. Again, in The Color of Law, Rothstein highlights an example in Detroit whereby the FHA would not move forward with a particular development unless the developer built a 6-foot high wall, cement wall, separating his development from a nearby African American neighborhood to make sure that no African Americans could even walk into that neighborhood. The underwriting manual for the Federal Housing Administration recommended, like I said, that highways would be a good way to separate African Americans from their white neighborhoods. And while, again, this was not a matter of, quote unquote law, it was a matter of government regulation. And it was, it was not covert. It was not hush hush. It wasn't hidden. So, it was definitely well known. And as whites fled cities, public housing units began being filled with lower income African Americans because there was this pressure, because these buildings had been built and now whites had emptied out, there was the pressure to get those buildings filled. And so they were typically filled with lower income African Americans, and also, those high standards that I talked about before in terms of, good jobs and being good neighbors went by the wayside. Again, in his book, Rothstein points out an example where in 1968, the city of New York abandoned its middle-class public housing programs and began accepting federal subsidies for previously unsubsidized projects. Long-term tenants with middle-class incomes who did not leave voluntarily were forced to move. The authority again announced that it was abandoning any requirements that it have of employment stability, orderliness, any of those things. And so many economically and socially distressed minority tenants were funneled into these sort of once middle-class projects. A change in the population characteristics, of course, was also accompanied by the deterioration of the buildings, management not keeping up with upkeep, and students attending neighborhood schools that now had drastically different and greater needs. So again, while this is about housing, you know, housing really does impact other aspects of life. And so as public housing became sort of racially identifiable and associated with poverty, public housing and mass media stereotypes change. And despite the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which expressly prohibited the discrimination concerning the sale, rental, financing of housing based on race, religion, or gender, attitudes and actions from the highest levels of government deliberately meant to undermine its intent still persist in 2020. I'd be remiss not to include where we are today in talking about sort of federal policies and how they impact racial inequities. And again, as I said, and I will state again, this is not a partisan issue, as I've just outlined, but in 2020, we still have a president who says, you know, that the suburban lifestyle dream, that you no longer will be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood. And we all sort of know what that means. And so the long-term legacy of racial patterns can still be seen nationwide in cities including Chicago, Atlanta, St. Louis, Cleveland, Detroit, Los Angeles, Boston, and as you'll hear from Tyler right now, right in Kansas City. Thank you.
I want to thank you so much, Mickey, for that very insightful and valuable history lessons. And I want to remind our guests to put your questions in the chat room, as we will have a Q&A session once our second panelist finishes, and we want to hear from you. Our next guest understands how cities are built. He is an urban designer and architect based in New York, whose work has focused on building cities at every scale, from master plans of districts and cities down to traffic management systems and transit systems. He has also focused his studies on the root causes of suburban growth and urban core decline. He is author of the white paper, Orchestrated Urbanism, The Race-Built City. Please welcome Tyler Kukar. Tyler.
Thank you, Diane. Share my screen. Okay. Thank you, Diane, for this event, and also thank you, Mickey, for that presentation, and really set me up perfectly to really talk about how this played out on the ground in Kansas City and across the cities across the country, but specifically in Kansas City. And I've really been researching this for about the last 9 years with my work in urban design and architecture and degree in history of architecture as well. I've really been diving into it, and as Mickey explained, it's very clear that our cities and communities have been designed for exclusion. And that's exclusion by race and ethnicity and gender. It's exclusion within our cities at the most macro scale to the public space, and then the built space in the buildings. And finally, it's exclusion through policy and law, as Mickey explained, through community and the NIMBYisms, the not in my backyard, the we don't want this here. And finally, in the physical built form, the actual buildings that we create exacerbate this exclusion. And so again, I approach this through an architecture and urban design frame, but everything I'm saying can be translated into other professions and our personal daily lives as residents of the city. And so when I travel and speak to students and different designers across the country, my goal is always to kind of adjust and change the lens we view the city through. And the way we view our current city is really one that's based on this perception that is ingrained in us from all of the outside forces, then the physical built city, legal and law policies, and then market forces. That's kind of how we see our built environment. And what I want to work to do is switch to one that's more empathetic and one that's rooted in equity. And I know we've heard this term equity a lot, and we've seen this diagram a lot, but it is really the root of creating more just and inclusive environments, right? If equality is just providing equal opportunity, it really isn't enough. It has to be about equity and understanding that we need to meet people where they are, and people don't have the same access to that opportunity. So we have to provide equal access to that opportunity. So it's about providing more for some that may need it to get up to a level playing field. And so this kind of equitable lens that I talk about, this new way of viewing the city, requires what I call the 3 A's, and I've said it for a while, I'll say it many times till you're nauseous in this talk, but it's about awareness, advocacy, and action. And if the way we view our city, the way we view our communities and neighborhoods is rooted in an awareness and understanding of how we got here, advocacy can come from that. We know who is impacted and we can fight with them. Finally, it can be manifested in action, whatever form action takes in your personal life or your personal profession. And so to do this, we have to start with building an awareness. And that's really what I kind of specialize in. It's helping people understand how we got here. It's really the starting point of all of this. You have to know how we got here to start to undo it. And I always use Kansas City as my tool to tell the story for a few reasons. One, I'm biased. I'm from Kansas City originally. I love Kansas City and have a passion for it. Two, it's a prototypical American city. I live and work in New York, and I could tell this story with New York, but it's has too many external forces that it kind of muddies the conversation. And finally, for better and mostly worse, a lot of the tools used to enforce segregation were maybe not invented in Kansas City, but were really mastered and executed to perfection in Kansas City. But there's also a lot of cultural touchstones that came out of this. Jazz, barbecue, the Negro Leagues, baseball, a lot of things all Kansas Cityans love, but we never think to question, why did those happen in Kansas City? Why are we known for jazz? Why do we have all of these cultural elements in our city? So just to orient you to the image on the screen, you'll see a handful of maps today, and they're all going to be roughly the same extents. North is always to the top with the Missouri River here. The Central Business District is here in the center. Going south, you can see Brush Creek and the Plaza. Anytime you see a red vertical line, that's Troost. That'll show up in almost every map, and it's going to be our kind of centering point. And the way I just described this map is kind of the way we view our cities and our neighborhoods typically. You know, where is this neighborhood? Where's the business district? Where's the crossroads? Where's Westport? But what if, you know, we look at the city just a little differently and we see it like this, one that's about the people, the community, and who lives there. This is a racial dot map. I'm sure we've all seen various forms of this for different cities. The red dots are Black residents, the blue dots are white residents, and the green, though lesser present, are Hispanic residents. And each dot represents 5 residents. And so you can see, even if the Troost red line wasn't drawn there, it's a very clear, stark dividing line that is created by where our the races are separated into the city. And so we really need to unfold that and question, you know, how did we get here? What happened? And we have to really unfold history a little bit. And, you know, we typically look at history as this kind of linear element. A led to B, led to C. It is this linear fashion. But I like to look at it a little bit differently, more of a web of events. And you don't need to read all of the events on the screen. It's not really important. But it's just the idea that history is not just this linear piece. And there's a lot of indirect relationships and effects that one event way back in the 1900s is still impacting the form of the city today in 2020. And we really need to understand that as we're designers or community members in a city. We have to act on what was really shaping the city we live in. And so this is a little bit of a confusing graphic, but this is just to say history, it repeats itself. We all know that. But what we have to understand is that it's cyclical and it's compounding. So if in the early 1900s, some of the events Mickey was describing shaped the city, in the next 30 years, something else is going to happen that's going to build on and reinforce all of the positives and negatives. And that's just going to keep compounding all of the effects till we get to today. So I'm going to just walk through very quickly. It's a short amount of time, so I know I'll miss a lot of the history. I'm just going to try to hit the highlights really quickly so we understand how Kansas City got here. So I'll step us through these kind of 5 periods, which are kind of terms I've given these different points in history that they're not official terms. They just help me organize it. And I start with kind of the roots. This is post-Civil War up until about 1908, which really showed there was no evidence that blacks and whites wanted to live separately. They really lived where, you know, the market and social forces allowed them, where you could afford to live. There's no legal policy saying you can't live here. And so this is, you know, very beginning Kansas City, again, Missouri River on the north, the early communities along the riverfront of the city. Of course, we're a river town. We're on the bluff. And as Mickey described, a lot of blacks were moving out of the South for jobs, for housing. And there's flyers like this. This is for Kansas, not Kansas City specific, but flyers trying to lure and attract people to their cities for jobs. Many came to Kansas City for the construction of the Hannibal Bridge. And the Hannibal Bridge was a game changer. It's what put Kansas City on the map, as was the first bridge to cross the Missouri River. So once that bridge was completed, and everyone was living in the West Bottoms essentially, and along the riverfront, it got crowded, it got dirty. And so everyone started to push up the bluff into what we know now as more proper Kansas City. And so these are kind of the early established neighborhoods. And we're gonna step through them a little bit. Because I find this important because a lot of historians start with the narrative of Kansas City and its housing and racial segregation just by saying that the black community was on the east side. And there's no conversation as to why that is and how they ended up there. And so we really need to have a conversation as to how they got to that starting point. And we have to start, of course, with the Civil War, slavery, and Porter's Plantation. Porter's Plantation actually sat right along Troost, just north of 31st Street, around 25th, 27th, spread out, of course. You can see the big house was right here, just west of Troost Lake. And just west of that was the actual slaves' quarters, just 1 block off of Troost Avenue. So if that's not, you know, foretelling and foreshadowing as to what's to come. But after the Civil War, the Porters began to sell off their land. And they sold it to wealthy white residents. And it actually became what's known as Millionaire's Row. So the wealthiest of the city lived in about a 6 or 7 block run of Troost in these massive, beautiful mansions. So as that was established, and now we have to move south a little bit towards the modern day Plaza in Westport. And this is where we get a lot of names that we're familiar with, and we're not going to dive into these gentlemen that deeply because there's, you know, a full semester course that could be taught on each of these guys. So there's Seth Ward, you know, Ward Parkway, William Rockhill Nelson of the Nelson Atkins and the Kansas City Star, and of course, J.C. Nichols, the most prominent developer in Kansas City. And so if we just look at South Kansas City, here's 39th Street, and Old Westport was the jumping point for a lot of the trails going west. By the time we got to about 1900, many of the historic older neighborhoods that we know to this day have begun to be established. The framework was there. Most of this was speculative housing, and a lot of it was instigated by J.C. Nichols. He was fresh out of Harvard, a real estate developer, and he first started buying land here because it was economical. but then started seeing the Nelsons and the Wards and their developments and said, you know what, there's a lure here of money and wealth, and I'm going to use that to my advantage. And so he started testing out his land use principles and his zoning principles. And he was very much in favor of single family zoning, large houses on lots, but also deed restrictions, which we'll get into the specifics of here shortly. But what's important about his deed restrictions are, instead of tying the deed to the physical building, he tied the deed to the piece of land, to the lot, and made them self-reinforcing, so they would never go away. And he also invented homeowners associations as we know them today, and had his homeowners associations enforce these deeds. So he really laid the groundwork for these, what will become restrictive covenants. And now finally, the last piece here is Kansas City's East Side growth, from about truce to independence. Was this guy, Willard Winter. He bought about 4,400 acres of land and built it all out on spec housing. Unfortunately for him, there was a financial collapse in 1893. Banks kind of pulled the plug, and property value was shot. And so people could buy the houses very economically. And that's how we get to a lot of the historic Black neighborhoods in the city. There's the Church Hill or Perry Place, and the Vine Street corridor, or kind of the heart right off of Paseo. And these two communities are different in a sense. The Church Hill or Perry Place started existing in the Civil War by Percy Coates, and he was big in the Free State movement. So he would buy land, buy homes, and sell them only to the Black community so that they had homes to live in. Then the Vine Street corridor was buying property and land that was lower and more affordable due to Willard Winter's kind of bust in his development. And so kind of ending this section, you'll start to see in this map here, the darker the shade of gray, the higher the population of Black residents. So this is around 1908, and you can start to see the concentration really starting to move east. Of course, they're still dispersed throughout the city, and this is the beginning stages, but it's really starting to form that historic core. So now we're moving on to the foundation. This is when a lot of the policy and legal barriers really came into play in cities across the country, but especially in Kansas City. And really what the cause of this was, wealthy white residents had their neighborhoods. They had Millionaires Row, they had all of that development to the south. It was middle-class whites who began feeling uncomfortable and challenged as they did not have an identity within the city. And so they began using certain mechanisms of control in order to maintain whatever neighborhood they wanted to be in. And that's violence, city beautification, land use, and policies. And so we're not going to dive into all of these, but of course, violence was used, bombings, fear tactics to keep Blacks in the neighborhoods they want them to be in, or keep them out of certain neighborhoods. There was city beautification, so Kansas City's famed Parks and Boulevard system by George Kessler. It's a beautiful system, but it's kind of early urban renewal. The Paseo, which blasted through the east side of the city, displaced 12,000 residents. And it was Black and white residents that were relocated, but white residents had much more opportunity and choice as to where else to move and be relocated. And finally, private policy starts to come in, and kind of citizen and community movement. Kansas City had something called the Citizen League, which had a racial justice or a racial group that they thought it was best to keep the races separate to prevent any potential conflict. So they said, let's keep it separate and not deal with it. And then there's an anti-ugly campaign, which basically said, we think single land use zoning is best. So what that means is they want homes in one part of the city, businesses in another part of a city, and industry in another part. They thought once you mixed it, it would lower property value. And finally, there was the racial covenances, which were perfected by J.C. Nichols, and J.C. Nichols then took those racial covenances and pushed them out at the national level on the National Real Estate Board. And his racial covenances were very explicit. There's a highlight from one of his developments over here, which basically, in quote, says Negroes cannot own or be tenants. And so it was really not mincing any words. And he's not the only developer to do this, and it happened in every city. He just happened to be very successful in doing it in Kansas City. And so then we move into zoning and land use. The first zoning was in 1923, and it really codified all of these individual desires that the citizens and developers had. And so I will just flip back and forth really quick. Again, if we see Truce, this red line here, and the historic Black neighborhood on the east side of Truce. As we move forward and we see the zoning map, what the city said was, we're gonna zone the east side to be industrial and manufacturing, retail, and high density apartments. So the dark blue is higher density apartments, the light blue is lower density apartments. So those are all of the things that citizens and developers had said are low property value. If you see the south of the city is all yellow, very little mixed uses. And so that's gonna be higher property value. And you can see to the left, the top photo is one of J.C. Nichols' early developments off of Brookside Road. And this other one is the Vine Street corridor around 19th Street. And so, excuse me, the photo is a little grainy, but you can see just the different use types and industry right next to housing from a very early stage. So if we move into redlining, which Mickey explained, so I don't have to go into too much detail, but I think you can see now the redlining is again reinforcing these barriers that have been put into place by private developers, by the city, and now federal lending practices have said this is dangerous to lend in. And the federal government treated manufacturing and industry as dangerous and as invaluable as Black neighborhoods. If you read to the left is the write-up that the federal government would do, and you can read the text, but it's this far-flung area containing the principal Negro habitat of Kansas City is that old section where values were shot several years ago, and it continues. So they were very, very explicit as to why they think this is a dangerous place to invest in. So Mickey explain this, and just a small tangent that the Black community through all of this was able to thrive and have community and culture that was successful and worked. And one of the things that came out of this is really a jazz and cultural evolution. It's something, like I said, all Kansas Cityans love, but we really don't question as to why. And it's really this mix of Tom Pendergast, the mafia, and prohibition, but also with redlining and segregation and having such limited places to live, jazz evolved from early on, from this big band swing entertainment, moving eventually into Jay McShann and Charlie Parker inventing bebop here. Jazz fundamentally changed because it was so tight and there was so much competition amongst jazz musicians. They had rent parties to try to pay their rent. And so the musicians would battle to get the job. And the speed of jazz fundamentally changed from a 2/4 to a 4/4 time signature. So this isn't about housing, but it's just to show that these housing policies fundamentally changed and helped create a culture that we still hold on to today. But the East Side and the Black community was thriving through all of this as much as they could. But they had Black-owned businesses, Black stores, Black homes. It was really a city within a city. So just again, wrapping up here again, you can see the darker shade of gray getting darker and more concentrated on the East Side. The population is really growing. And you can see all of the red shade is where the city was redlined, again, heavily on the East Side. And finally, the yellow dots are a majority of the jazz clubs. Not all of them, there was many of them, but you can just see how all of these forces are beginning to interact and align with each other. So now the formation, the physical barriers, the highways, the public housing. This started with the GI Bill, which low interest rates helped with housing. But of the first 67,000 low interest mortgages that were given, only 100 were given to non-white families. So that's a pretty contrasting and large disparity in who was able to achieve this. And so there's always this notion of white flight, and that did happen. Some whites did flee in fear, but it's really maybe a misnomer, because the talk of suburban life and people wanting to live in the suburbs always fails to identify why Black residents never moved to the suburbs. And it's because they couldn't. And white residents, even if they wanted to live in the center city, the loan would not allow them. They had to move to the suburbs if they wanted to. And so as residents moved out of the city, LP Cunningham, the city manager, went on an annexation splurge, and the city just ballooned over a 15, 20-year period because he didn't want to lose the tax base, which makes sense. but it also stretched the tax base, so there's less money to go into the heart of the city. But when you do this, you also have to connect to those residents. Those residents need to get into the city to go to work, and they need to get out of the city to go home. And so this came from the Federal Aid Highway Act. In Missouri and Kansas were actually the first states to build highways from this program. It started with I-70. And this is an image right here. This is the South Loop under construction. But if we look at the neighborhoods that these highways cut through, and you can see, you live in Kansas City, you see where this is going, you know where these highways go. You know, it cut right through the heart of the east side. It split the east side neighborhood into, with I-70, if you see my cursor here, and it physically was now a barrier from the center of the city and the economic opportunity. So this photo on the left, this is, you know, St. Mary's Church. You can see the Power and Light building off in the distance. This photo was, you know, pre-1940, obviously. And then more recent, and you can see the physical wall. It was no longer just a financial barrier. It was a physical separation by the government. And then just another one on what was 15th Street when the South Loop came in, and how these physical barriers really separated these communities from the heart of the city. And then finally, there's public housing, which Mickey talked about in a great deal. But again, the public housing that was for the Black communities was put into these already disinvested Black neighborhoods. So they were set up to fail from the beginning, and then they were encircled entirely by highway and freeway infrastructure. So they were not set up for any sort of long-term success. So again, ending this section, you can see again, the gray is getting darker and more concentrated on the east side. The population of Black residents is high, and you can see where all of the urban renewal is and all of the highways. Again, reinforcing this barrier that's been put in place. And finally, what I call the resultant, where this sort of perception becomes reality, this self-fulfilling prophecy of private individuals, of investors, of the government, looking down. They disinvested in a place for so long that its negative outcomes are going to come from it. So, you know, the summer of 1967, the Kerner Commission report to study that, it got it right. And you could probably do this report again today, and it would come out the exact same, unfortunately. But they said, you know, poverty and institutional racism are driving inner city violence, not Black vigilantes. And they said our nation is moving towards two societies, one white, one Black, separate and unequal. So they knew it then. And unfortunately, within, I believe it was like a month, or very soon after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and more protests came from this. And shortly thereafter, we did have the Housing Act of 1968, which, as Mickey said, was supposed to be good for housing and to prevent discrimination by race, gender, creed, what have you. Unfortunately, there's one piece of it, that's Section 235. And what Section 235 did was took the onus off of the city, and it put the funds into private hands. So it was up to private developers to develop and hand out these funds. And the funds were meant to help people making an annual income of between $3,000 and $35,000 a year. And it's for new construction and renovation of a home. But when the analysis is done, 80% of the money for new construction was given to white residents in the suburbs. And 90% of the money that was given for renovations was given to Black residents in the inner city. And real estate agents profited off this immensely. They would basically put lipstick on a pig. They would make cosmetic fixes to the home and then resell it to an unsuspecting buyer, usually a Black buyer in the city. They would come in, and then the house would fall apart, and they'd be unable to keep up with the repairs, and they'd have to foreclose on the home. There was an 8.1% foreclosure rate on this on the Section 235 homes. 99% of those foreclosures were in the central city. So it's very evident where this happened. And so the foreclosures had to stay vacant during the process as part of the government's guidelines. And then in 1973, Nixon put a moratorium on federal housing programs. And of course, no one then is going to invest in these properties when there's no government backing behind them. So it eventually sealed off and re-redlined these neighborhoods. And so if we just look at the kind of the power of the Housing Act in Section 235, in 1950, here on the left side, again, the red line is Troost, only 3 of the 33 census tracts were 90% or more Black. By 1960, 28 of the 33 were 90% or greater. And by 1970, 100% of the census tracts were 90% or more Black residents. So in 20 years, it completely finished the segregation that had been ongoing for some time. And of course, that's going to give us the image and the perception and the notion we have of inner cities. And the system had really failed the Black community. It was never created for success. And so there's a lot of reading out there about what this causes and what happens. But I think we know the narrative that this led to. Low property value, low income, lack of access to education and jobs led to low incomes. So this map, any hatch that's yellow is household income under $30,000 a year. And then violent crimes as well out of desperation. So again, the results overlay and align perfectly with the last 150 years of city planning. And then just to finish up on, in 2008 with the subprime mortgages, Black residents were 80% more likely to lose their home during this period. And so you can see any of these dark gray boxes are a high cluster of subprime mortgages. Again, here's Troost, the red line. So there again, these high subprime mortgages are concentrated on the east side. And then just to zoom out to see how stark it really is, here's the state line down the center of the page. KCK, which kind of mirrors Kansas City, Missouri in terms of the narrative, is the other place with high subprime mortgages. So this kind of set the stage for what's the return, if you will, which is kind of a misnomer again, but where we are today, reinvesting in the core, moving back into the city for certain people. And Kansas City's been doing a lot. This has to be updated because they have been developing at such a high pace for the last 10, 15 years, but tons of new housing, lots of new culture, entertainment, food, drink locations, new streetcar, which is phenomenal, right? Extending now all the way out to UMKC, talks about decking over the highway infrastructure. But again, when we look at the recent development, majority of it is, of course, on the west side of Troost and is reinforcing these historic boundaries and barriers. And there has been more of a move for development on Paseo and on Troost. And the conversation then comes about gentrification and how do you do this development in a way that is with the community and for the community and doesn't push them out to where they cannot afford that. So just again, seeing the racial dot makeup of the city. And so just a wrap up, again, just the reinforcement over time of all of these different policies. They've just re-ingrained these barriers, both physically, financially, and socially for Black residents in the city. And then I just, in 2 slides, I just want to highlight, the question is always kind of what do we do? And it's going to be different for every person and every profession. Something that myself and a colleague, Catherine Joseph, have really been pushing is the action and how do we actually act on this from a design standpoint. But what we do as designers is applicable to all professions. And really just the idea that inclusion is not the absence of exclusion, that inclusion has to be as intentional as exclusion has been. It's this idea now of you have to be actively anti-racist. It's that same idea. And really helping people understand that equity requires the ability to think outside of your own perspective. So final slide, and we'll have a conversation here. But through workshops we've run with designers across the country, we've really come down to 5 principles that, again, are for designers, but can be applied to your personal life or to your own profession. And they're really simple in idea, but they're hard to practice. And the first is obviously identifying and understanding your bias and confronting it. We all have it. Accommodating and identifying identities at different scales. Defining project-specific equity goals. So whatever you're doing, making sure equity is at the forefront of it. reacting to historical drivers. All of the things that Mickey and I have just talked through were on purpose. And so now we need to be intentional about undoing that. And then finally, centering communities' needs and goals, working with a community and not for a community. So with that, I will hand it back over.
Well, thank you, Tyler. And I have to say that you and Mickey both have given us a very insightful look at history. And Tyler, thank you for your perspective of looking at both the built environment and how that's interacting with policies and practices. I think that is very informative. So thanks to both of you. I want to address a few of the questions that have come in. The first is to ask, could you say more about the FHA and other government entity policies? Just trying to understand how much was put in law that you cannot lend or sell to Blacks, and how much was just the criteria that were put in place, like a poll tax, that the government knew that most Blacks couldn't meet. Just trying to understand a bit of the distinction there.
I'll start, Diane. And I want to be very clear that the Federal Housing Administration was crystal clear and deliberate in its intent to segregate the races. It wasn't, in many instances, just a suggestion that you include racially restrictive covenants. It was, if you want us to back these mortgages, if you want money, then this is what you will do. So it was quite intentional. Now, there were also sort of policies that were put in place, but again, the basis of our nation doesn't make it very, very hard when there are just suggestions promoting racial discrimination, for folks to act on that. So it included both. It included specific laws and also suggestions, policies, and that sort of thing. But all of that, quite honestly, was supposed to have been undone with the Fair Housing Act of 1968, right? Which explicitly said that one could not discriminate based on color, national origin, gender, and those sorts of things. And what it did, it also attempted to do what we talk about and what Tyler talked about, whereas you can't just not be racist, you got to be anti-racist. So there was a provision in the Fair Housing Act that stated, it's a provision called, and I always mess this up when I talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing. Right? So what that means is, I'll use it as an example back when I was a developer, right? So what that means is, in order to use federal funds, not only do you have to not discriminate, you need to figure out how you can market or develop to those who are least likely to come, right? And so oddly enough, in my situation, if we were developing in an African-American neighborhood, what that means is robust outreach to non-African Americans, right? And quite honestly, early on in the life of that law, not much was being done, but President Obama in 2015 really put some meat to that and said to cities, look, if you want federal dollars, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to put together a plan to show us that you have actively gone out and sort of surveyed and looked at your areas and looked at where there are areas of segregation. And you need to be coming up with a plan to remedy that. And both at the federal and sometimes at the local HUD level, those plans were were reviewed, and it was determined whether or not you had done what you needed to do to affirmatively further fair housing. Unfortunately, what happened in 2018 is that our current administration rolled back that policy. And you can see the last slide that I had where it was very clear about his stance on furthering fair housing. So, so to be clear, to sum that up, to be clear, I want to make it very clear that early on, the Fair Housing Administration instituted specific policies designed to promote segregation.
Thank you, Mickey. That's very helpful. And I want to note that we've been joined by Karen Slaughter. Karen is a neighborhood president, longtime neighborhood president of one of the neighborhoods with which the UNI partners, the Key Coalition. And maybe we'll ask Karen to say a few words in a moment about her neighborhood. I want to follow up with another question that we received. Tyler, you mentioned gentrification, which is a subject that always comes up. And the question is there such a thing as equitable gentrification?
Well, it's interesting that, gentrification is a word I don't like, because I think people throw it around and maybe don't fully understand what maybe the intent is. The real downside, at least in my opinion, and my work with gentrification, turns out to be displacement and pushing communities that have been there for generations, and many times forced to be there, pushing them out again. And so, the real question is there a way to equitably develop that centers and existing communities' needs, desires, goals at the base of that development project, while still being open to outsiders or newcomers to a community? And that is a really, really hard challenge. And I think it's something all cities and all development teams are working to try and do. I know in New York City, we have MIH, or mandatory inclusionary housing, which basically just forces developers in rezoned areas to provide affordable housing. But many developers find ways around that, or find tricks, and define affordable differently. So there's, I don't know if there's one real clear answer. I think we're still working towards that. And I think what Mickey said, in community outreach and community engagement, is really the root of it. And starting your development projects with the community, not coming to a community and imposing a design on them, saying, hey, we did this for you. Starting with them, what do you need, what works for you, and then starting from that point, which it's easier said than done for a lot of these developers, but I think that's where you have to start.
Well, thank you. And I see Karen nodding her head, and I'm going to call on her next. I want to comment on a couple of things. The advocacy coalition that you and I pulled together, we are working on an inclusionary housing policy, with the city, to advocate for the city to pass that, which was a recommendation from their own housing policy advocacy group. So that's important. The other thing I want to say about gentrification, it kind of harkens back to something Mickey said about affirmatively furthering fair housing, if I got that right. It takes intentional action. A neighborhood will turn over based on price. When the market goes up and the prices go up and so many people are renting and their property taxes go up, people will be pushed out unless there is a very clear and aggressive action to make sure that doesn't happen. So that happens with, policies, with practices, with other ways of subsidies, abating people's taxes. There has to be a plan so that doesn't happen. And when our neighborhoods talk about gentrification, they not only talk about one, socioeconomic group being pushed out by another, but they talk about the loss of the kind of historic character of their neighborhoods, which they're very proud of. And how do we present that character from being, totally lost by new folks coming in? Karen, would you say a word about Key Coalition neighborhood and what you would want to add to this discussion at this point?
Certainly. Thank you very much for having me. and asking me, I have to say both to both, Mickey and Tyler, your presentations were spot on, gave me a lot of notes to go back and look up because it touches on many of the things that not only myself, but my neighbors are interested in. Key Coalition was organized in 1977 as a not-for-profit organization by its residents. During that time, I was a teenager, but it was very, very encouraging and actually inspiring to watch my neighbors come together to go through the organization creation process. And to see that up close and personally is kind of what has allowed me to evolve into this role. With regard to the gentrification, currently.
Karen, you're freezing up on us and breaking up a little bit. I don't know if you can go to a better spot or there's something you can do to address that. Okay, why don't we, and Karen, I guess you can hear us, why don't we come back to you? I don't know if you can move or do something to address the fact that you've frozen on our screen. Here's another question, and maybe this is for Tyler. Are the historical dividing lines, such as Troost and the highway, still the same today, or have new lines emerged as the metro has spread out?
I would definitely say that Troost and the highways are still a dividing line. There are likely more new and additional dividing lines. I have read, I'm not as familiar, I don't live in the city currently, but I have read, on social media and that recently of some things in the Northland and different things. So I'm sure in the suburbs, both north and south, there are different dividing lines. But, I think the racial dot map really plays it out clear that these historical lines are still doing their intended job to this day of separating the city.
Yes, I think you're right. And I would add, yes, they are still a dividing line. What is starting to happen is development coming across Troost that you would not have previously seen before. The challenge is it is development at a different price point from the historic, residents who have lived there. And so you get into how do they not get pushed out? How do you work so that the retail that's coming in along Troost is at a price point where those residents can still access what's developing there. So it is starting to happen. All right, let me.
And can I just add one thing, Diane? I think what also needs to happen too, and this is coming as a recovering developer, is that local leaders need not be afraid of what developers may do if they institute really strong policies, not intended to just say we won't do this anymore, but to really atone for. So for instance, if we're talking about including affordable housing in areas or in a development that did not previously include affordable housing, putting some meat to those inclusionary policies though. A lot of times what I see happening is in order to appease the development community, what you get is you can include 25% affordable housing, or you can pay into this pot of money, which is never enough to compensate for the cost of actually producing that housing. So in areas that are gentrifying, I just think that local legislators, local leaders are going to have to be bold and not succumb to the development community in that respect.
Thank you. I think that's a great point. We are experiencing that. Karen, you are back. Do you want to try again and see if we will hear the rest of your statement? You're on mute now.
I apologize, we have some technical difficulties here, but what I was mentioning is our concern about gentrification. One of the things that we asked for when we began to notice the development in the area is that we allow homeowners to have tax abatements that would give them at least a 10-year tax abatement for investing in the exterior of their homes. We're pleased that we were able to get that blight study done and get it approved. So if a homeowner invests $5,000 in the exterior of their home, they are entitled to a a 10-year tax abatement. And that $5,000 does not have to come out of the homeowner's pocket. It can actually come as a result of their eligibility for some minor home repair program or some other programming or some other, the kids could decide to fix the home or put a roof on the house for mom, and that would entitle mom to that. We're also working very diligently with the neighborhood housing and the planning departments of the city because we want to be engaged in the type of development that occurs in our neighborhood. We have done a plan where we've been able to identify what the streetscape housing and future housing should look like so that it matches greatly with what's already existing. And lastly, what we want to do in terms of that stabilization piece to ensure that we can get those individuals that are renting to be able to stay here and those individuals that own their homes to be able to stay here as we see those prices increases and the taxes increasing, is that we're working now on a community land trust agreement. And the option for that is so that we can sustain and encourage those rental units in a way that allows the rents to stay affordable. And then we can encourage investment into and rehab into the existing housing stock so that we can maintain a certain level of affordability and have that grow right along with any new developments that are occurring.
Thank you. Good to know about those things that are going on. Another question, we've got a number of questions coming in. I can see we're going to run out of time. Do you feel disparities are still happening because there is not enough diverse representation participating on planning and construction committees? And any of you can address that. How much of a factor do you feel that is, lack of representation?
Something in our profession, in architecture and design, we always talk about the pipeline and getting people from the community into architecture, into design, into development, so that, when these projects happen, they're designing in their own communities. They know their community better than I or people outside will ever know that. So in our profession, we find the lack of representation is something we're really trying to focus on. And I know our firm is, going out of their way to hire people specifically to meet that need so that we can work more effectively in these communities.
And I'll add, Diane, that, back when I was in college, I didn't think much about the built environment. I didn't even know that, it didn't occur to me that there was a department of planning and all that. I did not find that out until I sort of tripped into a job, with a real estate developer. I will tell you, my undergraduate degree is actually in English literature. But, went back to graduate school after I realized that this whole field exists. I think we have to do a better job of highlighting the need for diversity in the fields of architecture, planning, environmental sciences, all of these things that lend themselves to the work that we do.
Well, thank you. And unfortunately, this will have to be the last question. I don't know who might answer it. Are there any efforts locally to make sure students in public schools across the metro area know the information that our presenters presented today? The historical information about our city and about national policies. I will say that I doubt that there is anything this in-depth in our school districts, but I would be happy to learn otherwise. That's all I can speak to. Any thoughts do you have, or from your cities? Is there any effort to teach this in the other communities you're familiar with?
From my experience, there's limited, which is what kind of spurred me into kind of an awareness building exercise when I go to universities. University of Kansas actually I go there a lot, and every time I speak to the designers there, they're like, wow, I had no idea, and these are 4th and 5th year college students. So I think it's something that I don't think exists enough, and that we should all, in all of our cities and communities, push to be taught.
Well, thank you. We do have other questions, but we're not going to be able to address them now. But perhaps we can address some of them in a follow-up. I want to thank all of you for participating. I think this has been very enlightening and informative, and hopefully it will spur all of us to further action. And as to what your ending slide said, Tyler, to think about what each of us can do from our various perspectives. So now, with just a few closing remarks, I will say that at UNI, we are working with our neighborhood partners toward comprehensive revitalization, as previously mentioned. And, we are working with our neighborhood partners, which are very important. Our longtime neighborhood leaders and residents have done a lot of work, but there's much more to be done. And we want to be a force that helps get that work done. Our board of directors has been sincerely committed to this task and has provided ongoing support and guidance for our work. Our board is comprised of a diverse group of business, nonprofit, and community leaders. We are very lucky to have, as the chair of our board, someone who brings a combination of real estate expertise and a desire to serve and make our community better and stronger. He also sits on the KC Chamber Board and is an executive committee member of that board. Please welcome Dave Harrison, president of Van Trust Real Estate, to close us out. Dave.
Thanks, Diane. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, it's an honor for me to serve on the boards of both the Urban Neighborhood Initiative and the Kansas City Chamber. As many of you know, UNI grew out of the Chamber's Big 5 initiatives a few years ago with the objective to revitalize the urban core. It's now on its own, nonprofit with a staff and board of directors, serving 10 of Kansas City's urban core neighborhoods. UNI's existence and its current impact on the communities it serves is a success in its own. But it's only a start. There's still much, much more work to be done to have a lasting, equitable benefit. In 2019, the Chamber added inclusive prosperity to its strategic plan. We know that our community doesn't grow stronger if economic prosperity is limited only to certain neighborhoods or certain parts of the metro. We must work together to make sure that all parts of the metro rise together. Same way that all boats rise to the same level when the water rises. These listening and learning sessions on racial equity over the past few months are part of that. The goal is to bring a greater understanding of the experiences of Black Kansas Cityans and the issue of systemic racism in our community. This is the neat part. More than 2,000 people logged on to virtually attend and view these sessions. So thank you all for taking part. As we continue to listen and learn, we need to take action. So led by the Chamber's Vice Chair, Mark Garrett, the Black members of our board of directors have been meeting to discuss the concrete steps the Chamber should take to address racial inequity. We're reviewing our strategic plan to bolster our efforts towards inclusive prosperity. We're already at work on 3 issues identified in these listening sessions: access to capital, tax incentives, and police governance. We got a lot of work to do, and it is critically important that we do it together. So please go to uni-kc.org, get involved, and help support us. Help Diane and the staff continue to make an impact. So in closing, I just want to thank you all for joining us today, and be safe.